lots of people are concerned about their midterm exams, and the weather is not particularly good. And it turns out I've just learned that lots of law professors have 1:30 classes and are preparing for them. So I apologize to Steve, and next time he volunteers, I'll try to schedule him at a more propitious time. I'm very, 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 very grateful to Steve. He's a friend of the center. I remember in 2002 when we had our the meaning of citizenship conference, and we wanted a really outstanding speaker to come, and we didn't have a great deal of money. He used his influence and got us Patricia Williams, who came and keynoted that conference. And again, in 2004, we were able to get Michael Buribi from Pennsylvania University, and he was a moderator of that session, and I think he helped us in that too. And he's always been a person I can talk to, and he's now giving his time to give this talk. He got his first degree from Yeshiva University, and then went on to a JD at Columbia Law School, and you know that's one of the most prestigious schools in the country. And he's currently the Walter S. Gibbs Professor of Constitutional Law in our law school. He's been here since 2002. Before that, he was a member of the faculty of Brooklyn Law School, and after that, or before that, the faculty of the University of Miami from 1986 through 1997. He's the author of 35 articles on constitutional law and legal and social theory, including a piece entitled Reimagining Democracy for Social Individuals, another one entitled Citizens United, and also What Makes Modernity Late. He's contributed to the Cambridge Handbook on Metaphor and Thought, 2008. So that was a piece then, and then in 2009 he had a piece entitled Philosophy in American Law, and in 2010, Law and the Humanities Introduction. They were all published by Cambridge University Press, of course, very prestigious press. And he has contributed to Law and Language, the current legal issues, volume 15, and this will be forthcoming in 2013. His book, A Clearing in the Forest, Law, Life, and Mind, published by the University of Chicago Press, another prestigious press, is the first systematic attempt to assess cognitive sciences implication for law and legal theory. Professor Winter is the former assistant counsel for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where he worked on more than a dozen Supreme Court cases, including brief and oral argument in Tennessee versus Garner, the landmark case which held the common law fleeing felon rule to be unconstitutional. He served as a consultant to both the Helsinki Watch Committee and the Central Intelligence Agency. He's on the editorial boards of the journal Language, Law, and Interdisciplinary Practice, and the board of the journal Law, the Journal of Democratic Theory. This past spring, Professor Winters was honored for his work as a philosopher and legal theorist by the Dutch Association of Legal Philosophy and by the Netherlands Journal of Legal Philosophy. A conference held at Wageningen University in Amsterdam on June 22nd this year was devoted to his paper, Down Freedom's Line. his current book project is about consumerism and democracy, from which this paper is adopted. So this is a little sample of the important work that Steve Winter has done, and it does not include his teaching and mentoring in the law school. He is one of those people who has anchored Wayne State's University's law school and make it a target, an attractive place for young faculty to come. So I am absolutely honored that he has taken his time from his enormously busy schedule to talk to us today on this topic. So even though it is cold and wintry outside, I'd like you to give him a warm welcome with applause.
Thank you all. Thank you guys for coming out. Not that busy a schedule, I'm on sabbatical. My wife's here, she'll tell you. I sit in my pajamas and work on my book most of the day. So we're going to play this little clip first, and then I'll tell you why. Some of you may be familiar with it, those who are not will get a good laugh. So.
Tomorrow night at 11, here it is, your moment is Zen. Today is Let Freedom Wing Day. It's part of the tour. Wendy, what's that all about?
This is the More Than a Mouthful Monday platter, and it's $5.99, and you get a burger and fries.
And this is all available out at Hooters. And nothing spells freedom like a Hooters meal.
We're going to turn off this light so I can, there you go. So nothing spells freedom like a Hooters meal. That is the first line of my book. Because it was such a gift. How could you pass that up? I rewrote the whole introduction as a consequence. And what's striking about that line is, the way I start the book is, why does that even make sense to us? Right? It's a non sequitur, right? What does the Hooters meal have to do with? But what's odd about it is, notwithstanding its inanity, however arch our reaction might be to it, it feels perfectly natural. And not only does it feel perfectly natural, we could spin out endless variations, right, without much thought. Nothing spells freedom like a Happy Meal. Nothing spells freedom like a Smith & Wesson. Nothing spells freedom like that new car smell, right? And you could go on. And you could put in any consumer item into that sentence, and it works very equally well. Contrastingly, if I say nothing spells freedom like a day at the polls, nothing spells freedom like a congressional debate, right? Nothing spells freedom like a campaign contribution, it doesn't work. It loses its semiotic punch, right? So what is it about our conception of freedom that's so skewed, right? In which the fast food of freedom is the freedom to purchase fast food. So that's sort of the intro to the book and the larger project about consumerism and democracy. This paper, which I'm supposed to talk about today, which is really long, it's about 55 pages, is the paper I wrote for the Amsterdam conference. All of it's going to be in the book, spread out amongst different chapters. I just sent the page proofs in, and at least for the first 6 months, they're going to post the conference online. So I'll have them post a link to the conference proceedings from my Wayne webpage. Once it's up, you'll be able to, and I encourage you to read it. I'm not going to be able to do it justice today. I'm going to kind of skim the surface. So I start this paper called Down Freedom's Main Line, which is a line from a song sung by the Freedom Riders, right? The integrated groups who went down into the South in 1963 on the buses and got burnt and beaten up, and was a line from one of the songs they sang. And I wrote this introduction, which is in some ways, I had qualms when I wrote it. I'll tell you why in a second. In some ways unusual for me, because I start with a distinction, and I really don't like distinctions. I think they're kind of a primitive mode of thought. Wallace Stevens refers to them. Distinctions are the products of a squamous mind. So that's a scaly reptilian mind, right? That's what that means. I think distinctions, although sometimes useful, tend to be very, very distorting and in many ways falsifying. I set up a distinction mostly because I thought it worked for rhetorical purposes between our neoliberal conception of freedom, which dominated the spread of democracy in that first period after the fall of the Iron Curtain in the 1990s, in which people, a lot of law professors, not I, but a lot of law professors from the United States went abroad to Eastern Europe and elsewhere and said, you know, if you want to have democracy, what you need to do is have judicial review and individual rights and markets, right, and strong rules of property and contract and markets, and it all work together, it'd be great. Didn't quite work out that way. Working in some places, falling apart in others, never took root in the former Soviet Union and Russia. Strikingly, both the Clinton administration and the Bush administration, their principal strategy in dealing with China was to encourage introduction of markets on the assumption that once you have people buying stuff in free markets, right, that democracy will surely follow. There's a false assumption that democracy and markets go together. And so one of the main themes of this paper is that, in fact, they don't, for a variety of reasons. I'll only get a chance to touch on them this afternoon. What I call the second wave, the more recent one, starting with the Arab Spring, but also the anti-corruption movement in India, which is huge, gotten some coverage in this country. The Chilean students movement, even huger or equally huge. It's got almost no coverage in this country. There's been between 10 and 100,000 students in the streets of Chile for like the last year and a half. Anybody know that? Protesting raises in higher education. There have been 2 New York Times articles about it. It's shocking. I mean, literally like every day for 18 months, as compared to say Occupy, which petered out. So I set up this distinction, and then false advertising. They say I'm going to talk more about the distinction, but I actually don't think the distinction is really the key point. I'm much more interested in paradox and dialectic, and in general tend to see things more synthetically and holistically, which is why I don't like distinctions. So here's the distinction. It's not that there are 2 kinds of democracy, there's only one, and the kind we have is false and fetishistic. The individual kind of, as I've already telegraphed with my examples about Russia and China, is false and fetishistic. And that's the nadir, that's the low point. Right? That's what happens when you take the neoliberal, the idea that what we are all sovereign preference maximizing individuals who go out in the market and satisfy our individual preferences, right, on the market side, and that we do the same thing on the democratic side, right? We have sovereign preference maximizing individuals, each with our own policy preferences, and we maximize our preferences by voting for representatives who have the same views, and then we aggregate, right, those through voting. And that's the sort of the party line, right? That's the conventionalism about democracy. And if you see it that way, you can see why people think the 2 go together, right? That's the conventional account. So the first section was actually the part 2 of the paper, not the first section. The second section says, do markets and democracy actually go together? And I examined it under 2 sets of assumptions. The first is the standard assumption on the economic, the assumptions of neoliberalism and market economics, assuming preference maximizing individuals, do markets go together? And then I examined it on a second set of assumptions, assuming that individuals are actually socially constructed, do markets go together? That's a more complicated story, a piece of which I talked about, well, it must be 7 years ago now, when I did a paper for the Humanities Center back around 05, I think it was, something like that, a long time ago now. It was an early part of this project. So here's the short version about markets and democracy. In a market, we aggregate preferences through price. Right? So if some of us like fast food and a few of us like haute cuisine, right? People spend their money on fast food, and those like haute cuisine, we spend a little bit more, we buy the good stuff, right? And then the market will produce as much of the fast food and the haute cuisine as we want, right? So if more people want fancy food and spend more money, the market will react, and there'll be more fancy restaurants, more Whole Foods, etc. Right? If very few people do that, right? Most people want fast food, there'll be more McDonald's, more Hooters, etc. Right? And the market can do that all perfectly well without us having to talk to each other, without us having to agree on anything. We never have to debate which is better, good fast food or haute cuisine or organic food or anything else, because the market can do that anonymously through price. On the democratic side, what happens is a little different, right? Suppose, let's take a simple case, suppose we have two groups who have very strong feelings. Some people like fast food, other people want better health, right? Want people to be slimmer, to less obese, and have better health. Some people like clean air, other people like cheap fossil fuels. Right? Some people favor a woman's right to control her reproductive capacity. Other people think that abortion is murder. We each vote for the candidates who agree with us. Right? So let's just pick one. Let's take the controversial one, abortion. Suppose I'm a pro-choice person. I vote for my pro-choice candidate. I happen to live in a district that's majority pro-life. We end up with a pro-life representative, and I'm out of the picture. I'm gone, right? If I was the haute cuisine guy, I still could go to the fancy restaurant and buy my food, but if I'm the pro-life person, I still get one representative, right? Now, there may be some other districts that have a different mix, so there'll be somebody else who who's pro-choice. But think about what happens at the legislative level, right? So it doesn't matter, you can do the numbers any way you want, right? So we'll say 65% pro-life and 35 pro-choice. What happens now, right? And the pro-choice people are represented, but they lose. They pass a law, right, banning abortion, there you go, right? Doesn't happen in a market, right? So in a market we can disagree, and the market takes care of all of us if it's working perfectly. That's an assumption of markets being perfect. In a democracy, if we disagree about basic principles, we have to sit down and talk to each other and work out a compromise. Right? And that follows because the basic device of the market is abstraction, it's money, things are monetized, right? And so price can mediate things in a way that other things can't. In a democracy, we have to sit down and reach some compromise. So let's just think for a second, this is a footnote in the piece, but those who are familiar with Coase will recognize the structure of the argument. Suppose we wanted to bargain over the abortion issue. Right? In theory, a bargain is possible. So the pro-life people could sit down with the pro-choice people and say, look, we'll cut you a deal. If you agree to give up abortion, we'll agree to give you free prenatal care and free child care and right, all sorts of other things that'll take care of the social burden of raising children. So it's a pretty good deal, right? So in theory, we could reach some kind of equilibrium on an issue, even though we profoundly disagree. Except in the real world, that'll never happen, right? Because for a variety of reasons. On one hand, the people who are pro-life also don't believe in big government, right? So they're never going to offer that kind of a bargain. And on the other hand, right, the people who are pro-choice, right, see the women's right to control her reproductive capacity as an aspect of citizenship and equality, therefore a moral issue every bit as much that cannot be monetized and reduced to a bargain. Of course, if the pro-choice people tried to bargain with the pro-life people, say, well, we'll give you some other stuff that you want if you agree to leave abortion alone. They'll say, we can't compromise on that because we're pro-life, we think it's a moral issue, right? So in a democracy, things have to be worked out. So the bottom line here is that democracy, one of the bottom lines is that democracy requires compromise, it requires tolerance, it requires empathy, it requires the capacity to deal with other people, whereas markets don't need any of those things. In a market, you could have selfish individualism, and it all works perfectly fine. In a democracy, that doesn't work. And we know what happens when the two sides of an issue can't talk to each other. That's why Congress has an 8% approval rating now, right? Because that describes what's going on in Washington for the last several years. All right, so that's on. That argument was based on the assumptions of neoliberal individualism. It turns out that Marx and democracy don't go together at all. There's another reason why they're different, by the way, and that is, I'll just do this briefly. In a market, every dollar is equal. In a democracy, every person is equal. Right? In a democracy, every person gets one vote. In the market, every dollar gets one vote. And the more dollars you have, the more votes you get, right, so to speak. Right? So if I have lots of money, I can spend that on lots of things and boost the market, and the market will produce more of the things that I want. If you're a poor person and you need public transportation, you don't have a lot of money to spend. You're not going to get a lot of service for that. But you can get any kind of car you want. So basic moral premise of the modes of participation are different, the basic moral values are different. When you think about people as being socially constructed, however, picture gets both very more complicated and much, much worse. So just think the best way to start this. So for the last roughly 260 or 70 years, we have lived in what's basically a consumer market, which is different than the market system that I just described, which has a lot of free sovereign individuals maximizing their preferences. Something very dramatic happened in 1740, 1750, 1760, first in London and then quickly, very quickly in the colonies throughout that period, where people just went crazy for goods. So much so that I think it's fair to say that Thomas Jefferson was the first bona fide shopaholic. I mean, the term hadn't been invented yet, but the phenomenon existed, so he would go to London and just buy everything in sight. If you've seen any of the movies, there was one with Nick Nolte a few years ago, he's just crate after crate of stuff that he bought in London that he's shipping home, and he died basically in debt because he just, he spent more than he had. And it was so bad that his friend, the Marquis de Lafayette, remember Lafayette fought the American Revolution, called him on it one day. Right? He says, so you got to get control of yourself, and you got to stop this. And here's Jefferson's response. He says, it is not from a love of the English, but a love of myself, that I sometimes feel obliged to buy these goods. So this, right? So this is a modern consumer, right? So, shop until you drop, or right when the going gets tough, the tough go shopping, right? This Thomas Jefferson's already there. So there's this huge. Mostly it was first porcelain, Wedgwood china, and fabric or textiles. People in the colonies quickly switched from homespun to the latest fashions coming off the boat from London. Got us into a lot of debt, and the British, they're spending all this money, let's tax them more. So between the increased taxes and the debt from the consumer items, the colonies in the 1760s and early 70s were in serious financial trouble, and that helped fuel the revolution. Although it's not the way the standard history is taught, but it's so consumerism enters the culture very dramatically in the mid 18th century. But the Thomas Jefferson thing is kind of instructive, right? That's and we all recognize that, right? We all recognize that, right? So here's the basic thing about consumerism. In this paper, I only talk about 3 aspects of it. In the book, I talk about 5. 3 basic aspects is the expression of status through purchase. We don't buy goods because we need them. We buy goods because they locate us in the social sphere. The other day when I was driving into Wayne, since I'm on sabbatical, I don't come in often, but I had a meeting I came in for. There was a guy in front of me in a Mercedes-Benz. Okay, so that's, we see plenty of those. But his license plate said third Benz. No, right? Not just that he was rich, he was so rich that he's got 3 of them, right? That's not. Right, and so that kind of makes the point. There's actually a nice story about Ben Franklin. Right? Penny says he's a penny-earned guy who used to have some porridge and no tea for breakfast. He ate it on his plain wooden plates, and his wife kept nagging him. Everybody else has the nice china from London. You're a famous man now. You should have good plates too. And he's nah. And so one day she just goes out and buys them, and he comes down for breakfast, and now he's got a beautiful china bowl and a silver spoon, and he says, such is principle. I forget these exact words. He writes about this in autobiography. So does principle go out the window, and luxury enters the household. Right? So this is going on in the Americas, but it's right. So the Mrs. Franklin is worried about what the neighbors are going to think. Right? I mean, it's not befitting his status in Philadelphia society not to have the same kind of wear that everybody else has. Wedgwood understood this, right? That's part of his genius, right? So when he develops his white plate with the border around it, right, that we're still using, basically the standard plate hasn't changed much since Wedgwood's time. He actually personally developed that. And the trick of that, reason he did that was by, if you have the white and then the round flat area, you could just take an enamel stencil and you could have hundreds of different patterns around, right? You'd sell 150 different plates, all identical, right? but each one with a different stenciled pattern, right? It's the same way we buy our cell phones and we snap on whatever color case we want. We personalize it, right? Wedgwood started that, right? Today we would call that modular production. Well, what was the first thing Wedgwood does? He gives a set to the queen, tea set to the queen, and then she uses it for high tea, and then he changes the name of his product from Queensware to Queensware, right? You could have your tea in the same thing that the queen is using. And he was actually quite a spectacular guy, this Wedgwood. Side note, he was ardent abolitionist and donated money to abolition in the United States. And he also was Charles Darwin's grandfather, just unconnected to his entrepreneurship. But he gets this commission from Catherine the Great for a set of dinner and dessertware for one of her summer palace, and he cuts her a deal. He basically sells it to her at cost, on condition that he gets to keep it for a year before she takes shipment of it. So he spares no expense. Instead of the stenciled work, he hires artists to do each plate individually, right? Costs him about 3,500 pounds. He sells it to her for about 4,000 pounds. It's a very small profit. But he puts it on, he has an exhibit in London before he ships it to her. And it was the first real blockbuster exhibit. We were lined around the block for a year in London, right, to get tickets to see. It's called the Frog Service, because it was the name of the palace was the Frog Palace. So it's the expression of status through purchase, so much so, right, that the goods become, I'm actually going to read you one little passage if I can find it quickly enough. So much so that goods become a pure sign. Right? So if you think about it, this is for some people a sore topic, not for me, right? The little yellow bracelets. Now, I assume people are finally taking off, right? And the red ones, and right, it's like you spend $1.25, but what's the real purpose of the bracelets, right? It's just to signify that you're in with the in-crowd, right? That's the, right? Or if you ever wondered, right, about the rock, the pet rock, or the chia pet, it was like, why do people buy these things, right? Because that's sort of the purest form of consumerism, right? It's a thing that doesn't do anything, right? But that's typical. So this is a famous passage from Baudrillard, who says, yes, that we can, quote, define the object of consumption by the relative disappearance of its objective function. In a famous passage, he describes the meaning of the tail fin. Remember the tail fin on the classic cars of the 1950s and 1960s? Designed to mimic the tail assemblies of fighter jets and rocket ships, tail fin is nothing but an allegory of speed. Quote, when the object itself is overwhelmed by a formal detail, the true function is no longer anything but a pretext. Speed, so apprehended, is the final passive state of an energy completely degraded to the level of a pure sign. Right? So that's a short step from the tail fin to the chia pet, right? So that's one. The second is the fetishization of the object of consumption. Baudrillard has this nice, and it fits with the status thing too. They're almost like interlocking social mechanisms. He says the consumer object is it's like a mirror. He says it's like the dog that only smiles. You never have to take it out for a walk. You never have to take care of it. Right? It just reflects back to you, right? Right? So you accumulate all these things that reflect back to you. This is who I am, right? So it's both the status, it's who you are because it tells everybody what your status is, but also right, they become like transitional objects, right? Like the blankie or the binky that the baby has. Only for the grown-up, it's the consumer. It's the smartphone. We all do this. I include myself, right? It's the smartphone. It's the latest gadget. It's the iPad. It's the iPhone, etc. Right? That becomes right. We spend more time with our iPhone or our iPad than we do with most of our friends or family, right? It's the dog that always smiles back. It doesn't require very much. Just to plug it in once in a while. But other than that, it doesn't require very much. There's a great line. This is from, this is a footnote in the piece. This is from the New York Times review of Toy Story 3. Therein lies its genius and its uncanny authenticity, a tale that captured the romance and pathos of the consumer economy, the sorrows and pleasures that dwell at the heart of our materialist way of life, could only be told from the standpoint of the commodities themselves, those accretions of synthetic substance and alienated labor we somehow endow with souls. cars, appliances, laptops, iPads, we love them, and we profess that love daily. Its purest, most innocent expression, but also its most vulnerable and perishable, is the attachment formed between children and the toys we buy for them. Right? So the consumer object is the adult's toy, and that's what we call it, right? Adult grown-up toys. And it serves the same role, right? Although, notice one difference between the consumer object for the adult and the toy or the transitional object for the child, right? Because the child transitions, right? The child goes from love of mommy to love of the blankie to be able to, it's a transition to being able to love others in a more mature way. The adult consumer doesn't transition, right? He or she stays with the, right? So it's not only narcissistic, right? Not only do we fetishize the object in this very narcissistic way, it's regressively narcissistic, right? Whereas the transitional object moves you on in life, it matures, right? This is a psychological regression. So there are 5 elements. The expression of status through purchase leads to the escalation, I call it, not in this paper, but in the book, an escalation paradox, right? Because that's so yesterday, right? You have to have the newest thing to keep your status, right? So, and you buy, even if you're an early adopter, soon everyone has it, then you have to buy something else to show that you're, right, the high status person, right? So it's a never-ending treadmill, right? It's a trap. And the one that I like the most, there's actually 5 of these, I'm just going to do 4, is what I call the consumer paradox, is that the more choices we have, the fewer choices we end up with. That's illustrated nicely with the story about the plates, right? When Wedgwood starts, when they're first doing everything's handcrafted, every pot's different. Every shape is different, and you have lots of different kinds of pots and lots of different shaped plates and bowls, etc. Because one of his innovations was, we now call it just-in-time production, but he innovated this as well. He would only have 1 cup and 1 saucer from each set in his London shop. One plate, and you'd come and you'd look at it, and you'd say, oh, I like that one, and then they would make it to order. Right? That way you didn't have to carry much inventory. The problem was, when everything was hand-thrown, it never came out the same. So he had to standardize it, right? That's why he changed the shape of it, and that's how he ended up with the white, because that gave the most consistent results. Same way that Henry Ford ended up with black, right? Everyone knows the apocryphal. It's actually apocryphal, but Ford supposedly said you can have a Model T any color you want as long as it's black. Right? The reason for black is it was the fastest drying paint. So you can move them on the assembly line. The reason why our China is white, because it was the one that gave the most consistent results in the kiln. It would come out the same color every time. That's what used to be. They were black, they were gray, they were green, right? And now they're all white, right? with the stenciled colors. And actually, not only does the color change, but once he becomes successful, everyone copies him, right? Because that's what the market demands, right? And the actual number of shapes go down from about 350 different choices to only 150 different individual bits of China within about a decade's time. But if you think about it, right, we experience this all the time, right? That's if iPhone comes out with a new gizmo, right, you know the Android is going to have it the next release, right? And also patent litigation will ensue, right? But, right? When back in the browser wars, which is now ancient history, right? When Internet Explorer had something, Netscape had it, right? Had the same thing, and vice versa, right? So in many ways, right, the market converges consumerism. So how much I should leave time for questions? So I'll stop in a second. So what's the upshot of all this, right? We experience buying things in the consumer market as freedom, right? That we have many more choices, right? We experience ourselves as neoliberal subjects. And here's the first paradox. That's a construction of the consumer market. Right? The fact that they give us all these things we can choose from. You get a round plate with any kind of stencil, cell phone, you can snap on any kind of cover you want. That's what makes us think that we're choosing individuals. If you don't believe me, you want to test it, pick a fight with a friend or a family member and just insist that there's no such thing as free will and be really firm about it. And then time, how long it takes them to say, of course there's free will. I can go to Burger King or I can go to McDonald's. Seriously, try it, because if not, they'll do iPhone or Android or something similar, right? It takes about usually 20 to 30 seconds to get somebody retorts with that. So we've experienced that as freedom, but of course that's all, this is all constructed, right? That is to say, a set of industrial processes, a set of social processes that forms consumers. Notice too that the consumer is this kind of easily manipulated person. The person who thinks that he's free and choosing is actually easily manipulated. To think you have more choices when they're actually going down, in some sense. Because there's one sense we can get many more, we're much richer, we have many more things, right? But we have in many ways fewer choices, and we think we're doing things because we want to, but in fact we're involved in this unconscious status competition with all of our neighbors and friends, and being driven by those forces. We don't experience it that way. We buy the Mercedes-Benz because it's a good car, right? That's everyone justifies it in that way. But in fact, they're being moved by social forces that they're usually not aware of. And then think about how easily, well, there's one example, it's a little too close to home, right? But think about how the university is manipulating us on the parking. It's true, right? I mean, normally in a market, what happens if you charge too much for something, right, then people don't buy it, right? So they introduced the hang tags, was it last year or 2 years ago? And they charge a lot of money for them, and most of us didn't buy it because it's not worth it. We can use our one card and park much cheaper, right? And then they were very upset because no one was buying the hang tags, right? Now in a market, that would tell them that they don't have a good product, everything, right? That they're overpriced in the market. But no, they don't do that, right? They raise the price of the of the daily parking so that now you pretty much have to buy the tag, right? And that's the the thing about how that translates in the political sphere should be fairly obvious, right? We went into Iraq for WMDs. It almost wasn't a thing anymore, right? Because the math destruction just became a brand, right? WMDs, right? Which of course weren't there, or any other commercial, right? I saw one last night for the bridge things. Attractive young woman says, don't you want to be able to choose whether we have a bridge instead of those nasty politicians deciding? Have you seen this commercial? They can sell us anything, right? They make anything sound good. And that's in fact how we work. So let me just say, because we've talked about the downside of freedom, let me talk about the upside of freedom. So the first paradox is the paradox of the choosing subject is itself a social construction. We don't choose to be choosing subjects. We're acculturated to be choosing subjects, right? So that's a paradox. We're acculturated to buy the consumer stuff, to need the Mercedes-Benz, the smartphone, the whatever the yellow wristband, whatever it is. The second paradox is that freedom requires other people. Freedom requires dependence, right? Because when you think about it, if you want to do anything, you need to cooperate with other people. It's sort of the lesson of the comparison between how democracy works and how markets work, right? If I'm worried about global warming, I can buy all the squiggly light bulbs I want, but it's not going to put a dent to me, right? If I really want to do something about global warming, I'm going to have to get together with millions of other people to change, right, our patterns of consumption and our production of energy. There's no freedom if I can't change the basic terms and conditions of life, right? If I can't have an impact on global warming or what reproductive policy is going to be or anything else, right? And I can't do any of those by myself, right? I need to be in coalition with other people. Of course, the ancient Greeks knew this, right? The guys who invented democracy, before they called it democracy, they referred to it as isonomia, which more or less translates as equal share in the law. The democracy was a later coinage. And of course, they had a very radical form of democracy. It was only applicable to a few people, only males, only property owners. But within that substratum, everybody voted in the assembly, right? And then the officers were chosen by lot. The boule, which was more or less the executive committee, was by rotation and lot. So there really was a sense of at least the people who mattered, to them who mattered, I should say. Everyone participated. Of course, our sense of equality of who matters is thankfully much broader, but democracy involves a different set of commitments. It's not about sovereign individuals who merely tolerate each other, right? But real freedom involves, this is Hannah Arendt, of course, is famous for making this argument. Real freedom involves cooperation with other people, the ability to do, and that occurs only under conditions of solidarity, communicative relations, empathy, mutual support, mutual recognition, and mutual respect. So that's where the paper ends up. That's about 20 pages just on that stuff, as you can imagine. But that's a not so quick sketch of the argument.
Thank you.
Just about 2 minutes, if you would, please connect the things you've said up until this point to the movements in India, Chile, and elsewhere. What is it in those movements that you see that might possibly, in your view, provide an antidote to this neoliberal trend that has originated here?
Yeah, there's actually a section of the paper on Tahrir. So I use sort of Tahrir elsewhere as my set piece on that. But Chile is a good one. Let me just talk a little bit about Chile, right? Because the guy who's the prime minister, president, I guess it is in Chile, is the guy who invented the Chilean credit card. He introduced the credit card to Chile, right? Whatever they call Banco something card. I don't know what it's called. I know, but I can't remember. And his view of higher ed, this will be familiar to us. We know this, right? His view of higher ed is it's like a consumer good. And people should have to pay for it. And just the same way if you buy a car, you go into debt, and students should borrow money to pay for their education. And Chile is a little different than us because they have two systems. It's a smaller country, right? They have a private university where the elite goes, it's very expensive, and they have a public university system where everybody else goes, and it's traditionally been mostly underwritten by the state. And so they're trying to raise the fees. This has been going on in our country for 20 years, so we're all familiar with this, right? Just to put things in perspective, I've been here 10 years. When I came to Wayne in 2002, the law students were paying 1/3 of the cost of their education, and the state was underwriting 2/3 of the cost of their education. It's now completely flipped. Law students are paying for 2/3 of the cost of education, the state's paying for less than 1/3. And that's a trend of disinvestment in public higher education that's been going on for 20 years. And, Michigan State's been that way for a long time. So this is all familiar to us. So that's what got them in the streets in Chile, right? That's what they're I don't want to say rioting because that's a negative term, but that's what they're demonstrating about. So it really puts their argument is no, education is a public good. If you want to have a successful, a democratic and economically successful society, people have to be educated. The government should be investing in this, right? Privatizing is going to destroy the system. Of course, they have a pretty substantial middle class, but they're not quite as wealthy a country as we are. So if they had to pay our prices for higher ed, you can imagine what would happen. So I think that's a really good example. I'm not actually as familiar with what's going on. They only have a passing familiarity with it. The sense that I have from the media is that it's clearly, in some ways, not unlike our sense of politicians here. Although I think the sense that they're just in it for their own, lining their own pockets. But as I understand, corruption is pretty rife in India. So that's in a much more kind of overt way. The Tahrir Square, I said, is a set piece here, because what's interesting about Tahrir Square is the sudden and very dramatic change in social relations that occurs during the Tahrir Square demonstrations. Sudden and dramatic and in many ways short-lived, right? But particularly if you follow the trajectory of gender relations in Tahrir Square, and that's mostly what I focus on. So it goes from sort of endemic harassment of women in the streets of Cairo. I actually have the figures, but they're not in this paper. They're in a different paper. But something like, I think it's 85 to 95% of all women in Cairo say that they've been molested on the street in one way or another. And then suddenly, women are walking down the street and taking leadership roles in the demonstration in Tahrir Square, and nothing's happening. It's like this dramatic, sudden change. In the early days in January 25th, following January 25th, 2011, the Muslim Brotherhood would do what they do in the streets, where they would surround the women with a cordon of young men to protect them from being groped, and they were doing it in Tahrir Square until they realized that it wasn't necessary, because that just wasn't going on. Now, it all ends pretty horrifically with the Lara Logan rape, and that's, I said, it's very dramatic, it's an incredible change, and then it goes away incredibly fast. I mean, I talk about both dimensions of that. But the short version of it is that what happens is there's this moment, and any of us who are old enough to have lived through demonstrations in the 60s, I think, experienced the same thing. There's this moment of a different way in which people relate to each other, right? Of solidarity and mutual recognition and respect. And Tahrir Square is a nice example of it, right? Because you have a society that profoundly disrespects women, right? And then suddenly, within this very short period, that gets overturned. Again, it doesn't last more than about 30-odd days, but so that makes the point in a very powerful way about what I merely just referred to, the role of solidarity and communicative relations of mutual recognition and respect being essential to democracy and freedom. And of course, Tahrir Square is actually right, it's exactly about that, democracy and freedom. Right? So it's the nice. Jan?
Steve, I think I had a related question, and that is recognizing the two paradoxes you spoke of enough to change a social structure if it's deconstructed?
No. So the basic, this paper doesn't make this argument explicitly, but the book makes the argument explicitly. So the basic argument of the book is takes a strong view on social construction. And that's why I start with the Hooters thing. So what kind of people would we have to become for that to make sense? We understand why that makes sense, right? Then we understand, right, this larger social process, which, as I've tried to suggest, is about 2 to 3 centuries deep, historically deep. So the basic argument is that our social practices construct our values and our sense of subjectivity, and that the consumer subjectivity is what our society has constructed, so that nothing spells freedom like a Hooters meal actually seems to make sense to us. A little odd, but that's why I gave you the Burger King. Right? Of course, there's free will. I can go to Burger King or I could choose to go to McDonald's. Right? That is how we think about things.
Well, it seemed a little deterministic in a certain way. I guess that's my
yes
question.
And no. I'm actually very careful to stay away from that. I mean, I say it shapes who we are. It doesn't necessarily determine. But I do think that at the end of the day, it's only about changing the social practices.
Right.
So the penultimate chapter of the book is called Was Machiavellian Humanists? Because he was a civic Republican, which is mostly known for The Prince, but he was just trying to get his old job back. But now the interesting thing is that Machiavelli is the guy who invents the militia, which is what led to the Second Amendment. And his argument was, right, if you want to have people who will be other-directed, right, who will work for the public good, right, who won't have civic virtue in the classic Republican discourse, who won't have, in classic Republican discourse, being self-interested is called corruption, right? Virtue is putting aside your own self-interest for the public good. He says you need to have citizen soldiers. Because it's only as a citizen soldier, that's where you learn to, right, in a life or death situation, to put your own selfish interest aside for the greater good. If we have citizen soldiers, then people afterwards will know how to be good citizens. So his basic, and this is Pocock's argument in the book, the famous book, The Machiavellian Moment, right? And that was the main line of Republican thought from Machiavelli through Michael Harrington, who was a Scottish political philosopher in the 17th century, and the person that people like Jefferson had read, right? Through Jefferson, agrarianism, agrarian democracy. That was the Harrington-Jefferson line was, if you want, right, upstanding, independent citizens who participate in government, they've got to be, right, they've got to be stout yeomen. They've got to have their own, their own 40 acres and a mule, and that's where they'll learn self-dependence and self-reliance that they can bring into the public sphere. And Michael Sandel makes this point in a book he wrote about maybe not
Justice. What's the?
No, it's the late '90s book, Democracy and Its Discontent. I think it's called something like that. He makes the point that through the Knights of Labor in the early decades of the 20th century, the principal argument in American political thought was, what kind of social institutions do we need to have to create good citizens? That, of course, dies away in the 20th century. So actually, the epigraph to the paper, I love this line, hopefully you'll enjoy it too, is from Horace Mann, who's the father of the public schools. Because he wrote this in 1848, I think. Yeah. Quote, "It may be an easy thing to make a republic, but it is a very laborious thing to make republicans. And woe to the republic that rests upon no better foundation than ignorance, selfishness, and passion." And the whole public school movement, as well as the public university movement, right? University of Michigan was one of the early ones. Virginia was the earliest. Both the public school and the public higher education. The entire idea was to construct Republican citizens. That was the point of it. That's what people like Mann and John Pierce here in Michigan wrote about in the 1840s. What we need to do is have everybody go to the same school, so people learn to get along with each other, people from different classes, different economic, right, learn how to be able to handle and tolerate them. And indeed, Charles Sumner, who was one of the leader of the Radical Republicans, author of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, when he argues the first school desegregation case in 1849 in Boston, a case called, he loses, a case called Roberts versus City of Boston, that's his argument, that it's not a public school if the black kids can't be there too. And he says if the black kids aren't there, he says the white kids won't learn to be good citizens. That's his argument. He says it's going to harm the whites. The white students are going to suffer because they won't know how to relate to black citizens on terms of equality if they don't learn that in schools. So this, because we're destroying the public school, both at the higher education level and at the elementary level. But the whole idea of the public school was this radical social experiment. And indeed, in the 20th century, the public school, urban public schools in America were this agent of assimilation, right? Where people, from different ethnicities. The Italians and the Jews, of course, mostly it was racially segregated still, right? But people who were otherwise thought of themselves as quite different and distinct, right, had to interact and learn to get along. And it was a major socializing influence. That's, of course, been gone, but with the white flight in the 60s in response to desegregation and the destruction of the inner city schools, I think that rarely happens anymore, except in some individual places.
So I spend a lot of time studying China, and not only your argument about the fact that markets and democracy or freedom don't go together, they actually, it seems like there's a natural extension of an argument that in which you're saying markets harm.
Markets in their current form.
Actually prohibit or harm the practices of freedom and democracy. Yeah. And
you know the line. I don't know if everybody else knows the line. But the woman on the dating show.
Yeah. Oh, I'd rather cry in the. I'd rather cry in the back of the BMW than smile on it. Right. So, and this gets to my question. My question would be: first, I want to make sure that I'm interpreting this extension of your argument that this could actually hurt the development of democracy and freedom. But my question is, in thinking about this public space, because really what you're talking about is limiting public space, and in China, the public, if there's any place where you do see public space, it is in the internet. It's this virtual space, which you see not only this sort of growth of the market, but you also see the only signs of participatory democracy in which people force the government to deal with issues that they try to sweep under the carpet. So I'm wondering.
It's an interesting point. I do think that that's probably true in China, but it's not true here. Right? The internet has almost been completely crowded out, I think, by consumerism. But in China, clearly, it does serve that function. And not so much in Russia, I think, but maybe they just are better at the censorship of the internet.
Yeah.
Sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah, no, I'm just wondering if, this public, if we can, and also when you think about the Arab Spring, the role of these new technologies in this new virtual space, and the role of
as I read it, I think that the role of technology in the Arab Spring was
overestimated. Okay. I don't know that case as well, but I definitely would argue strongly in China.
You persuade me about China. I think that's probably true about China. I think it played a role in the Arab Spring, but the main role was to get everybody out in the street.
Okay, right. Where in China, literally the participatory action happens
online.
Because
they don't have much other option. No, I think that's right, except for Wuhan.
Right, but Wuhan, well, there's always, Wuhan, there are lots of protests and demonstrations happening in China. But the reason why Wuhan could happen was because it was backed by that actions that happened on the internet. So the minute Wuhan ended up in the press, then you could have the public action on the ground because everybody's watching. And what the government does then
So they
is
didn't
a
want
lot
to repeat
more-
Tiananmen Square, obviously. Yeah.
Right. So
The army literally camped out around the town and didn't move. And
right, and that makes it so. The minute it gets in that virtual space, is the hope that you could actually create something on the ground in China. So it might be different because of the political environment, or.
Yeah, I don't know.
And you don't see it happening.
Yeah, I don't.
in
Well,
other
I mean, the
environments?
Pirate Party in Germany is trying to do something like that. It's a little crazy. And, you know, most people, Germans that I know, think it's. I mean, on the left think it's crazy and absurd. So the Pirate Party, you know about the Pirate Party? There's a bunch of young hackers and techie people, and they basically organize around the software. So they've written the software. They can all log in. And if you go to, you know, they actually have like 3 representatives, I think, now in the parliament. And you say, what's your position on, you know, the Middle East? And go, wait a minute. And they take an instant poll of all the other Pirate Party members sitting around in all the cafes in Berlin, which makes it very hard to form a coalition with them. That's what the lefties are complaining about, because they don't know what their position is on most things. It changes depending on the outcome of the instant poll. That's, but that's, you know, that is this, you know, it seems crazy, but, you know. What I do think is crazy is, so there's a good article in the first page of the business section today's Times about the election, and it's based off of this book by 2 Harvard economists. So there's a real choice between 2 modes of capitalism, right? Did you read this article? So it's the cuddly kind, like in Scandinavia, and people don't work as hard, and then there's the, you know, the more inhumane kind that we have, where there are lots of winners and losers, but it creates more innovation, and that's and greater wealth, and, you know, Obama, Romney. But, you know, there is a sense, and I quote this at the beginning of the paper, you know, and the guy who runs Davos says, this is a quote now, capitalism in its current form no longer fits the world around us. That's a direct quote. This year, from the guy who's the executive director of the World Economic Forum at Davos. When he says that, you know, right? And there's a reason to think that that's really true, right? I mean, the recession, right? The crisis in the Eurozone, nobody's got a fix for these things. Capitalism is not, neither capitalism nor democracy are functioning as problem solvers in the way that we normally conventionally understand them to. And I think that, you know, this, I'm trying to tell in part a story why. That's why I said it's not a distinction between 2 forms of democracy, it's a distinction between a form of democracy that's in crisis, that's collapsing, right? And older, different idea of what democracy is about that we need to figure out how to reinvent. But I do think that's interesting to me about Occupy and Tahrir, right, is the creation of social spaces, right, in which new social practices, right, can be born. So what's interesting about Occupy, although it's died apparently, right, is this thing, right? So if you want to know what the position of the group was, they say, all right, we're going to vote, and then I forget, this means yes, you like it, and I don't remember what they did when they didn't like it, right? And their chant was, this is what democracy looks like, right? I mean, it was participatory democracy. So it was about creating the space for new kinds of social practices to arise. No, I think that probably uniquely in China, the internet is serving that function, but I'm not sure that it's working that way anywhere else, at least that I'm aware of. The main role in Tahrir Square was about 100,000 people signed up to promise to go to Tahrir Square on January 25th. So its principal role was getting all the penguins off the ice floe, right? So you wouldn't be the only penguin jumping, right? That was the main. Once they were in Tahrir Square, they didn't have internet access, right? So it served a role. I mean, it was, but it was a much more limited one. I mean, I've read most of Wael Gonin's book, and my sense is, you know, he was a Google executive who was, he wasn't the only person on the internet. There were other Egyptian groups. There were 3 or 4 of them that were coordinating. But you know, the way that Western media is like, look, it's all our technology, right? So I think that's been overhyped in the Tahrir Square story. Any other questions? So I'll try and put this up on the web. It really depends when on the Dutch people post it, and then I'll post a link. There's like 4 comments on my paper, and then I wrote a response to those 4 comments.
Thank you.
I didn't know I spoke for his dog connections to Romney or Obama. It's such a clear position.
Yeah, so the law school, we do everything. I get my own consumer on it.